On October 23, 1947, thousands of Mainers woke to a beautiful fall day, and none of them could be aware of the impending natural disaster that was about to change their lives forever. From October 14th to the 27th, 1947, more than 200 forest fires raged throughout Maine, consuming nearly 250,000 acres of prime forests, and in some cases wiping out entire towns. York, Oxford, and Hancock counties were especially hard hit. Several others throughout Maine were threatened. In many cases, fierce winds gusting up to 80 miles an hour drove these fires so rapidly that hundreds of homeowners escaped the massive flame fronts with only the clothes they were wearing. Generations of heirlooms and other prized possessions were lost forever. In 1947, fire officials on both the local and state levels had little ability to communicate with each other, complicating the situation. And no one was prepared for a disaster of this magnitude. Drought conditions existed as little or no rain fell during the 3 months leading into October. The weather for the entire forest fire season was unusual, going from one extreme to another. In early March, an abnormally warm period saw temperatures reaching into the high 80s, causing snow to melt quickly and disappear from fields and woods at about the same time. To those engaged in forest fire control, this was an ominous sign. However, the months of April through June were cold and wet. By mid-July, a complete reversal of weather and ground conditions took place and continued well into fall. During that period, 108 days passed without any appreciable rain. The dryness of the soil was reflected in the foliage, especially with hardwoods. The lack of moisture caused the leaves to dry and fall prematurely. Vegetation was bone dry, and Maine was ripe for burning. On October 23rd, all hell broke loose.
Someone called and said, "You've got to get out." And we jumped into a Model 8 Ford of my cousins and headed for Route 113 and got caught in the fire. The fire had crossed the road, and we were debating what to do, and turned around and it was in back of us. And I remember my cousin, he said, "This old baby will go anywhere." So he backed it up and turned it around, and we went back around the mountain.
In Brownfield alone, 200 homes and businesses were destroyed. The community was gone. Sadly enough, Brownfield was not the exception. Many small towns were gutted by these conflagrations.
It was a very hot day, and knowing the fire was in progress, I was helping my mother make corn chowder to take to the fire line that evening. And at noon, they came and picked it up, told us that no problems, we would be safe, because it could never cross Shepherd's River. Well, then by mid-afternoon, they came through and told us we had 20 minutes. So we were totally unprepared.
The town of Newfield suffered too. In the Goose Rocks and Cape Porpoise district of Kennebunkport, more than 200 homes, most of them summer cottages, were destroyed as this fire burned its way to the Atlantic Ocean. In Hancock County, Bar Harbor, with its palatial summer homes and grand hotels, all sustained massive damage. Half of the landscape in this world-famous summer retreat was blackened.
And there was a lot of leaves around and so forth. This was in the middle of October. And spacks were landing all around, but we were doing a pretty good job putting them out underneath the porches and things like that. And I happened to look up on top of the roof, this Marvin Hotel, which was huge, and the Belmont was right next door to it. And there was a little patch of fire, probably right, oh, so big, you know, right by the chimney. It was gone, just that quick. Just that quick.
In Washington County, residents in the towns of Jonesboro, Machias, and surrounding communities had to be evacuated. More than 20,000 acres of timber and wildlands were burned. In a 1-hour period on October 23rd, the fire traveled more than 6 miles.
I was up in North Waterboro when it went across the road and burnt the board yard. And that was you've seen how boards are stacked, you know, and that fire would hit them, and it was almost like they would explode. That would take boards, 12-inch boards, 10, 12 feet long, right into the air, all the fire. You know, there was such a current from that. And I tell you, it's scary when you see something like that. If a train was going, if you laid in the track and the train went over, it wouldn't make any more noise.
In 1 week, 15 fires, each burned at least 5,000 acres. In many cases, families had only a few minutes to gather their belongings before leaving their homes for safer ground.
And Mary said, "Doris, what do you want me to save?" And I said, "Well, I like my piano, but I know you can't save it." "Oh, yes," she said, "we can put it in the dump truck." So it was on casters, and they wheeled it out and put it in the truck. The last time I saw Brownfield, when we got to the Ricker place, I looked back, and Brownfield was all ablaze.
The wind was blowing real, you know, almost like a hurricane. And of course it was blowing all this fire along ahead of it, which was consequently starting more fires. Just a hopeless situation.
On the evening of October 23rd, Governor Horace Hildreth declared a state of emergency. In a broadcast to the people of Maine, he requested all citizens give whatever help they could to the Forestry Department. The President of the United States, at the request of the governor and the Maine congressional delegation, also declared a state of emergency. The President's action immediately made available war assets equipment and tools from the Office of Civil Defense for all the fire areas. The Forestry Department asked for help from both the Army and Navy, and got it. Soldiers provided much-needed equipment and additional manpower to help weary volunteer firefighters battle the fires. By month's end, nearly 36 Maine towns had sustained heavy losses. 9 were practically leveled, with property damage totaling nearly $70 million. Timber losses were estimated at $10 million. In today's terms, these losses would equal well over $3 billion. Hundreds of Mainers lost their jobs as many businesses also were destroyed. 16 people lost their lives.
People just couldn't believe, you know, the devastation. It just, I think it humbled everybody. And that's why for years afterwards, and I think even today, there are enough of us alive that when we have a fire, you know, you got to get to it, that's all.
When the last flames were contained, more than 2,500 people were left homeless.
You can't believe the noise. And I said, I'd been overseas, and I think I was as scared during the fire as any time when I was over there at times. You know, you just figured that you weren't going to get out of it. You just figured there was nothing ever going to put this fire out. You know, you kind of began to get the feeling the whole state was going to burn. In fact, there wasn't much that stopped it till it got to the ocean.
I remember down behind our house there, when that come up behind the fields there, the fire probably was quarter mile. Up behind our house was a field there, probably 8 acres in it. And the grass was this tall. And I'd taken my John Deere tractor. All the neighbors, I took plow and plowed a lot of furrows around, but you know, it didn't mount nothing. But that field burst in flame just like you put 100 gallons of gasoline in it, threw a fire in it. I mean, you had to see it, believe it. I mean, just explosion all over it.
Throughout those 2 infamous weeks, hurricane-force winds caused havoc for firefighters, making control efforts extremely dangerous and often impossible.
You could hear it coming. It was just like the sound, I can't describe it. Just very loud, just a roar. And we saw this sheet of flame, and it rolled just like this, made one roll, just like you see water on the beach. And the house was gone. It exploded. And we turned to run because it wasn't not a good place to be, and the hoses were steaming.
Firefighters frequently had to drop their equipment and run from flame fronts, reaching as high as 300 feet. The intense and erratic fire was unlike anything firefighters had seen before.
It was blowing. It was a funny feeling. The embers, the smoke, you would hear roaring, just like a freight train roaring, and then there'd be complete silence. Nothing. And it was eerie, and then it would start again.
Relief finally came for thousands of weary firefighters on November 8th, when rains fell over much of the state.
Several days afterwards, yes, longer, after I'd gone back to work, I drove through the Eagle Lake Road out to the head of Somme Sound, and that was really just flat. And I can remember of saying, I think the rocks burned too. Everything was so black and bare.
Throughout the ordeal, Mainers pitched in, neighbor helping neighbor.
Everybody helped everybody else. There was never any place anywhere that had more people working together than there were here in town. And, it was wonderful, really.
The Red Cross and Civil Defense helped feed and temporarily house the homeless. Hundreds of steel buildings were brought in by the military to serve as homes, schools, and churches, some of which are still in use today. Never in Maine's history had so many people been affected by such a disaster, and never had so many people come to the aid of their fellow citizens.
You were speechless. There was nothing anywhere. And to get through the highway was something in itself. The trees were burned, the limbs were down. It was just an unmistakable mystery. But everybody else was in the same boat. Everybody pitched together. You were no worse off than your neighbor, and everybody was just together.
It takes something like that to find out how much you appreciate your neighbors and your relatives and everything. That was good.
When the smoke settled, the damage was not unlike that of a massive bombing raid seen during World War II.
Just something that nobody ever believed could possibly ever happen to them. And it's like, I'm sure happened in the war when you're in Europe or something like that, and you don't know, you live in your little town, and then the first thing you know, it's all bombed out. And so what did they feel like then? What do they feel like now? And it's the same odd thing that we had here, see.
At times, you didn't know whose houses it was. I mean, there was so many gone, you didn't know where you were. Oh, I remember so well feeling so empty, so sick to my stomach, and so scared. And my folks were just devastated.
As I remember driving through town, all you could see was cellar holes and chimneys. The chimneys were still standing and it was still smoldering, and there was steel roofing, which was basically what most every house had, was steel roofing. That, of course, that survived, and that was all a rumble and mess. And, quite devastating. Something that you don't forget right off. It's kind of burns in your memory.
Investigations into the causes of these fires revealed several sources, ranging from careless backyard debris burning to unattended campfires, and all too often, many of these fires were believed to be arson.
The 1947 fires in Maine are considered Maine's worst natural disaster. They're the result of the perfect storm of environmental conditions. Over 3 months of drought, combined with the buildup of forest fuels and brush, followed by dry, hurricane-force winds. Since that catastrophic event, many improvements have been made in how we fight wildfires. Most importantly, we cooperate better with other agencies. There are mutual aid agreements in place between towns, states, Canada, as well as federal agencies. Secondly, we are better trained and have learned how to manage our risk to make sure all the firefighters return home after a fire. We have also studied how these fires spread and strive to teach homeowners how they can reduce the chance of their homes igniting from airborne sparks and embers. The type of firefighting equipment available to Maine's forest rangers today is much better for fighting wildfires. The overall strategy for fighting wildfires has also changed. Rather than chasing wildfires, we now often use indirect control lines and point protection, where firefighters are pre-positioned at structures before the fire arrives.
What do you have for a water source?
They've got a good water source further up the road, quarter mile on the left.
We are also using the latest technology to improve communications on wildfires.
Yeah, affirmative, and just be aware, helicopters inbound about 30 minutes out.
The 1947 fires have had a major impact on open burning laws and wildfire prevention programs in the state of Maine. While firefighting equipment, tactics, and organization have improved greatly since 1947, over 90% of all wildfires are still human-caused. We all need to learn from the hard lessons of the past and be careful with all outdoor fires.